our final, I guess, DC LERA webinar for 2020. Anything that's final 2020 actually sounds good. Really looking forward to this session today, and thank you for joining us. My name is Patrick McHugh. I'm the current president of DC LERA, and I'm the faculty at George Washington University. Today we're going to be talking about the union representation in the NFL, and we've got two guests. We've got Mark Hyman, who is a veteran journalist, professor, author, lawyer, and he is currently the inaugural George Solomon Endowed Chair in Sports Journalism and directs the Shirley Povich Center for Sports Journalism. Prior to that, Mark was a faculty member at George Washington University. So we miss him dearly, but very happy for his success. Prior to that, he's had a sports journalism career at the Baltimore Sun, Dallas Times Herald, Business Week. And he's authored 3 books looking at the adult managed world of youth sports. And Mark's role today on our panel is going to be in conversation and asking questions of Adam Richelieu. And Adam is the salary cap and contract manager for the NFL Players Association. He's the primary point of contact for NFL agents and players for their contract negotiations. He's been heavily involved in research and negotiation process that led to ratification of the current collective bargaining agreement. He was named Forbes 30 under 30 list in the sports category for 2020. And while I know Adam is a graduate of Auburn University, I believe, he's also a graduate of George Washington University. So this is very much a GW panel, so excuse us for flaunting that a bit. So Mark, if you can start off, and Adam, and conversation, and just to let everyone else know, the participants out there, that you can pose questions in the chat and I will gather those up, and after Mark and Adam have a bit of a conversation, we'll turn to some of those chat questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks Pat, very much. I want to thank the DC chapter of LERA for inviting me. This is a lot of fun for me to be doing. And I'm going to learn, I think, quite a bit today in conversation with Adam. And also thank Pat. Pat was a wonderful colleague at GW. And Pat, I miss you too. And this is a great chance to be together and to do something together. Just a word about Adam. Adam, at GW, I was his professor. He was an exceptional student. That was evident from the beginning. I remember him coming to my office one time to share with me this elaborate statistical model. I don't remember exactly what the purpose of the model was, but it was unbelievably impressive. And he spent a half hour in vain, mostly, trying to explain to me how it worked. And from that experience, among others, it was clear to me that his commitment and intensity and drive, that this guy was going somewhere. So it's absolutely no surprise to me to see Adam doing the important work that he's doing now. So I think the plan for today is for me to fire questions at Adam for maybe 35 or 40 minutes. And I've got a list that, I don't think we're going to get to half of my questions, but we'll stop at about that 40-minute mark and take, as Pat said, take questions from the audience. And I think we'll start with a little bit of, some bio points so that we get to know Adam a little bit. I have the advantage of knowing a little bit more about Adam than most in the room do now. He grew up in Northern Virginia. As Pat said, he is a graduate of Auburn University. His dad is a very prominent civil rights attorney. Adam, I'd like you to reflect. Think about 2 or maybe 3 formative events in your life, kind of snapshots, that pointed you on this career path and to the job you're in now.
Well, first, thank you for the quite generous introduction. It's always a pleasure to see you again as well. As far as the transformative events, I think for some of the folks in here who are familiar with college sports, this will pop out in their head. But at least when I originally graduated undergrad, civil rights work was something I was interested in. I took a legal internship at a legal nonprofit down south, just trying to take a gap year to figure out if that was the path I wanted to take. And while I was doing that, I took a part-time job with Auburn Athletics as an event manager. So I would help organize, gymnastics events, but football game days for one that I did as well. There was a game back in 2013 that a lot of people refer to as the kick six, which was where one of the Auburn players returned a missed field goal back to win the game. I was actually on the field working that night. And I remember walking home after that game and seeing, people who had never met each other before, just high-fiving and hugging everywhere on campus. It was about a 20-minute walk back to my house at that point. And I remember just thinking to myself, I really wasn't enjoying the legal work all that much, and sports had always been a huge passion. So it was funny that this little side job, if you will, ended up sort of igniting a flame within me. And I remember calling my mom the next day and telling her, hey, I'm not going to law school. I'm going to go the sports route. And, the parents took a little bit of a warming up to on that front. But I think, 7 years later now, things have worked out for the better. So that was definitely probably the one that sticks out in my mind a lot. But then even as you mentioned, that analysis program I put together that I showed both you and Lisa back in the day, I think it's one thing when you have a passion about a subject matter. It's something else when you actually start showing signs that you can do it full time. So I think for me, it was once I started putting together that package that you discussed and showing it to people, it was seeing their reaction, thinking, okay, like it's not just I'm passionate about this, I want to do it. It's I can do this now. I just need to develop those skills. So I think those are probably the 2 points that stick out in my head the most.
Yeah, I'd like to acknowledge Lisa Narati, who you mentioned, who is the director of the sport management program at GW. I think Lisa is on the call, and I know you feel as I do that Lisa's been so helpful in helping you reach this, helping you advance your career and think about what you want to do in sports. So hat tip to Lisa. So let's talk about your current role. You started with the NFLPA as a contract analyst in 2016. And since 2018, you've been a salary cap and contract manager for the PA. And as we know, every sports league has a compensation system that places restraints on player compensation. That's a product of collective bargaining in every professional league. And some of those restraint systems are hard caps, others are soft, others are luxury taxes. What's notable and different about the NFL cap?
Oh man, well, I could take up the full hour just talking about that alone. But as you know, I teach a class on sport finance and capology, and each sport can be unique and more difficult than the others in one way or another. Where the NFL can get quite complicated, and you mentioned it a second ago, a hard cap versus a soft cap, which for anyone who doesn't know, a hard cap is a situation where clubs cannot spend over a certain amount. A soft cap, put simply, is where they can exceed that threshold, but there might be certain penalties that come into play. Things, as you mentioned, a luxury tax. The NFL can be a bit of both at times. There are certain points in time where, for instance, the off season, only the top 51 guys will count against a club's cap. Whereas the second that the regular season kicks in, every player on the roster now kicks into that salary cap total, if you will. So it's a way that clubs can circumvent the salary cap to, if you hear about players getting 90 men in the training camp in the off season, that's how, is because we have ways to sort of circumvent that hard cap level via a soft cap system that, again, once the regular season kicks in, it goes back to being a pure hard cap system. There's also ways where if a club ever goes over the cap, they can have 7 days to get back under, but at least that transaction can still be processed. In sports like the NHL, that's not always the case. There's times where if a transaction is going to put the club over the cap, then all of a sudden the league will not process that move until the club is below the cap again. Now, I think the one area where the NFL cap system gets particularly tricky is the fact that our contracts contain more terms than in other sports. There's more negotiable terms in the NFL contract than in other sports. Whereas you hear about in the NBA, most of those contracts are fully guaranteed. So a player will have base salary, and very infrequently will they have a bonus like a signing bonus, and roster bonuses are expressly prohibited in the NBA as well. And an NFL contract, you might have 2 years worth of guarantees, then a third year that's half guaranteed. You'll have per game roster bonuses, March roster bonuses, signing bonuses. So for the NFL cap system, what gets really tricky is trying to keep track of all the different contract terms and how each may affect a club's cap space year to year. I think that's probably the most concise yet comprehensive way to view that.
So it's, I think, evident, self-evident why teams would need cap managers and to monitor their, compensation of players very closely. Why does the PA need a cap manager?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. It's actually one I asked myself when my current boss first reached out to me about coming on board at the PA. But I think the reality about the union side is we need it just as much as a club does. Because one thing you notice is that players have different contexts. They have different situations that they're all in. And people have agendas as well. So what's good for player A may be bad for players B through Z. And same thing could be viewed the opposite way as well. So part of what can be tricky about my job at times is trying to balance between being both utilitarian, which I need to look out for the collective good of all the players, while also keeping in mind the individual circumstances of each player. So having someone in my position who can work with all the agents, like Agent X, for instance, only represents players 1, 2, and 3, and Agent Y only represents players 4, 5, and 6. So Agent X is only going to care about the well-being of players 1, 2, and 3, but having a sort of intermediary, if you will, someone who can work with both of them and try to balance both of their interests as well as the collective good of the players can help me see the bigger picture and help make sure that every deal is getting as much money as possible. Because there have been plenty of times where I'm helping both Agent X and Agent Y, and I might tell Agent Y, hold off on signing this. I think Agent X is going to get more money on this deal that can help your player. So being able to take the agendas on both sides and marry them in a way where everyone can get the best possible outcome is, in my opinion, why my job is important on the union side.
Who are your clients, Adam? Are they players, agents, both?
Well, the agents like to think they're our clients, but in reality, it's the players, which again may seem ironic. I spend 95% of my job talking to agents, but the reality is I'm talking to them because the players are my clients. They're the ones who pay our paychecks, and as much as agents pay dues, that's more for administrative costs. At the end of the day, if I have to pick between doing what's in the player's best interest or the agent's best interest, there's no question at all. It's the player's best interest every single time.
Give us an example of a conversation that you might have with an agent before, during, or after a contract negotiation. Either a research request that you might receive, or a request for a clarification of a term in the CBA.
Yeah, absolutely. And then those questions can vary greatly, obviously, depending on whatever situation is there. But the typical life cycle of my communication with an agent for one specific player would be the agent reaches out a year prior to the player's contract expiring and they just say, hey, we know our player is going to become a free agent next year, or might be a restricted free agent, depending on the player's situation. And they'll say, we need an idea of what this player is going to be worth, what he needs to do on the field this year to change that. And from there, we'll strike up a dialogue about where's the player's headspace at. Does this player want to stay with the club that he's with? Is this player wanting to go to the highest bidder? Does he want to make as much money as possible? How much do taxes come into play? Are there certain areas of the country he would like to avoid? I think everyone wants to live in Southern California or Florida for the most part, but some people may not be as inclined to move to a northern state. You'd be shocked how frequently that happens. And then from there, both the agent and I will do independent research. On a personal level, I prefer not to see what other people's thoughts are on a player until after I've collected my own. And then once all the data is collected, I run any predictive models I need to. At that point, the agent and I hop back on a call. I say, look, based on factors X, Y, and Z, I think this player is going to be between salary range A and salary range B. And we do something in the NFL called comps. It's short for comparisons. We find players that we think have either similar production or similar age. And then we say, okay, based on this player making this much, we're going to go to the club and say, this is the guy we're basing him on. But we also have to do sort of a exploratory analysis as well to see any player we mention, what are possible counter arguments that the club can raise based on that player as well. From there, we get into the negotiation phase. That can be sooner or later, depending on if a club is looking to re-sign a player or not. But from there, what I will help do is put counter offers together. The clubs will almost always make the first offer on a player. It's, as you hear in negotiations, you usually don't want to be the first one talking. But once a club makes an offer, obviously they're trying to save as much money as possible. We're trying to get them to spend as much. So we see where they came in, we see where our target contract is, and then we just try to counter based on that. We try to see what's the cash flow like, how much money is he getting in year 1 versus year 3. And then we try to adjust. Sometimes I think a lot of people are familiar with negotiations in here. Sometimes you kind of want to do wherever they go low, you want to go equally high to sort of match in the middle. Others, like myself, I prefer to say, this is my number. I'm going to come in slightly above this, but I'm not moving much off this. But again, that's personal taste in a lot of ways. But from there, again, the counters can be a little confusing just based on where the numbers are, which contract terms are being included. But then once we get to a contract or a rough contract that we like, that's when I get into contract review, which is they send the physical language of the contract over, and I review it for any legal and or financial concerns from there. And then the favorite phone call of every agent is me calling them up to say, this is good, go get that money. So it's kind of the life cycle, and a lot of these negotiations I had one that just ended a couple months ago that was 16 months long. We had at least one phone call every single week, but throughout the year, I handle probably 200 negotiations with both rookies and vets. So it's keeping a track of a lot of different moving parts and phone calls that, again, take up in some situations over a year.
So the conversations you're describing are primarily with agents. Are there occasions when you're talking directly to the player, and what would be the reason for that?
Yeah, it's really at the player's discretion. It's a lot of the information and knowledge that I can give out is high level at times. So that if you are not familiar with what an escalator is, then our conversation is going to be very, very slow at that point. So just based on the fact that agents are the ones who have significant experience handling these contracts, that they're typically the ones I speak to. But there are a lot of times when a player may call me directly, or they might be at an office visit and they stop by my office and say, hey, what do you think I'm going to make? Either because they want a second opinion on their contract without their agent being included, or whatever it might be. And in those situations, that's when I will gladly get on the phone with the player and walk them through basically everything as best I can, that I would normally go through with the agent. Sometimes it's a slower walkthrough. Other times there are some players that I've been extremely impressed with. They get on the phone, I feel like they know a lot more than their agent does at times. So, but other than that, again, to your question earlier as well, the players are my clients. So whatever they want me to do, if they don't want me to send something to their agent, then I won't. At the end of the day, I think a lot of players struggle to really comprehend the idea that at the PA, we work for them. It's not the other way around. There are some players with some excellent manners who are super polite, but at the end of the day, I'm like, look, I work for you. Whatever you need, ask me, and I will 100% do it without question. But yeah, other than that, that's really where I get on the phone with players and help them. It's not as common as the agent phone calls, but it's something I'm actually thrilled to do most of the time.
Is it ever the case that an agent rejects your advice or pushes back on advice that you give them?
If I had $1 for every time an agent didn't listen to my advice, I would have been retired 2 years ago. Yeah, I mean, it happens. And again, people have agendas and interests. Sometimes, to sort of quote my boss here, for players, more often than not, waiting to sign a contract is going to be their best option. There's always risk trying to wait another year to sign a contract just because a player might get injured just based on the nature of their work. But more often than not, the best advice I can give is don't take this offer. Just wait another year, become a free agent. But again, sometimes whether it's the agent not wanting to lose a client or the player just wanting to take that security now up front, there have been plenty of times where people don't listen, but that's okay. At the end of the day, my job is to give the best advice possible, but it's really easy for someone like myself to give advice on a contract situation when it's not my money at the end of the day. If it was my kid and they had $50 million staring them in the face, I'd have a really tough time letting someone talk me into saying, no, we're not going to sign this now because I think we're going to get 52 million next year. Why wouldn't I just take the 50 million that is staring me in the face right now? But yeah, it happens frequently. And I think the more that you develop relationships with people in this business, the more that they will come to respect your opinion. There's times where agents have been very unhappy with my advice, but they listen to it. And then maybe a couple months later, they tell me they're glad they did, or that I'm a rotten SOB, who knows? But either way, yeah, there's no real right answer. Like everything is 20/20 hindsight in a lot of ways. But at the end of the day, yeah, it's kind of a touch and feel, and there's a lot of trust. But there's times where things can get heated, or otherwise we just might agree to disagree and move on.
So we're 20 minutes into this conversation and we haven't talked about COVID yet. So I think we have to pivot in that direction. And I mean, there's endless number of things we could talk about, but I think the bottom line is that, sports have been turned upside down by COVID, from bubbles to testing to alarming positivity rates. The Major League Baseball season nearly was stopped by an outbreak among Miami Marlins players. And as we know, in the NFL, there have been several outbreaks, most recently the Ravens. I'm curious, are COVID protocols subject to collective bargaining? And what role does the PA play broadly in helping to establish those protocols?
Yeah, so they absolutely are. The one difference between a COVID type protocol versus something that might regularly appear in our CBA is that with all the COVID procedures, that's something that we agree to in an SLA, or a side letter agreement. And those were, for lack of a better term, a pain in the rear end to work through. I think this is true of most industries, is that anytime you run into an unusual circumstance, it's a good learning opportunity for when it may happen again. What's been extra difficult about these COVID protocols is, hopefully I'm not jinxing anything, but I have a tough time envisioning a pandemic affecting the NFL again in my lifetime. Possible, but kind of doubt it. So with a lot of this stuff, you usually say your thanks and think, okay, well, I know what to do next time. This has been for both the league and the PA and the players and the clubs, basically every player involved. It's been shooting from the hip a little bit because no one has really dealt with this. Even very few people are still alive from the Spanish flu back in the day. So yeah, we've come to a few agreements on working procedures, things like how to get players into the venues. But even on my side with the salary cap type work, what's been really tricky is the salary cap is always based off of something that we call AR, which is all revenue. And the gate revenue is included in that. So people buying tickets to games. So when people are not showing up to stadiums as much, or maybe they're not buying apparel as much because they're at home and they're not out shopping, that affects all revenue, which thus decreases the salary cap. So the future forecasting of what contracts might be worth is really difficult right now. But other than that, yeah, we work through a lot of the COVID type protocols with the league. And I think we're on 8 or 9 different side letter agreements at this point in the year, which normally we get 1 per year. So it should be a good example of how much this has affected things this year.
Interesting. There's a reason that you made the Forbes list that Pat referred to at the top, and that is that you are really a tenacious advocate for the players. And part of your job is to, as we know, to review player contracts and to confirm that they comply with the CBA. In 2017, you discovered a problem in contracts of 160 players on 25 teams. And I wanted you to explain that to the audience. What was the issue and what was the resolution?
Well, first and foremost, I want to clarify, I did make Forbes for a reason. It's because I had a tremendous sports finance professor at GW. But to your question with the contract issue, one thing my boss and a couple of my mentors have told me a few times is that with the CBA, you need to read that thing every single day. There's no amount of times you can read it where you're going to know everything. It's too dense and there's too many convoluted issues. So something when I first started out at the PA that I was trying really hard to do is familiarize myself as much as possible with all these various different provisions, even the ones that seemed obscure. And my original job was just to review contracts. I wasn't helping out with market analysis until the promotion happened. But when I was reading through rookie contracts, I thought it was weird that some of the provisions that were in these addenda were the same thing from veteran contracts. And I remember talking to my boss about it, and like he even referenced, hey, I'm pretty sure they can't be including all these different terms. So what I started doing was tracking which clubs were using what type of contract terms in all the different rookie contracts. And from there, we found out that in Article 7, which is one of the CBA articles, we found that there were impermissible terms in rookie contracts, that there's a list of 13 non-compensation terms that clubs can include in addenda for the various rookie contracts. And anything that was not on that list could not be included in a rookie contract. So from there, started charting, I can't remember exactly how many years back. I think I went like 8 years back or something like that. But went back about 8 years, looked through every single rookie contract for every single club and started figuring out which clubs were violating those procedures, which I think was a bit startling for me, because you think about something as serious as a CBA and you think, there's no way one side's going to violate this and be this intentional about it. But it kind of opened my eyes to how important it is to need to enforce and routinely check things that a union may agree to with an employment body as well. But that's basically the short version of the impermissible terms, which I believe is what you're alluding to.
Yeah, so take us through kind of the timeline. What happened? So you bring this to the attention of the PA, your colleagues first, and then what happens in a case like that?
So our general counsel, after we had done our analysis, he spoke with some of our counterparts up at the league office. It's called Management Council for the NFL. Brought that to the attention of Management Council, and we actually, myself, Tom DePasso, our general counsel, Eric Winston, who is the NFLPA president, and Mark Levin, who's the director of salary cap, my boss. The four of us actually went up to New York in, I can't remember exactly when that was, but we went up that same fall that we got everything amended, and we had an all-day meeting with the league office to talk through that issue and to say, look, we need to get this fixed. This is what we agreed to. How can we come to a compromise? And there are times in these discussions where the league or us, just to be fair, one side may disagree with the interpretation of a certain provision of the CBA. And at that point, we have to come to an understanding, MOU as they call it. But we have to come to an understanding as to what we can do to rectify this situation and move forward with a common understanding. And fortunately, we were able to do that after some give and take, but it was an interesting process to see firsthand, especially going up with Eric, Tom, and Mark.
So are there damages or a remedy of any sort in this case, or you simply agree to an understanding of the revised language?
It's more we come to agree the understanding. I mean, part of what, I'm not sure I can get into specifics of this, but part of what we agreed to is that certain clauses would be severable ab initio from the beginning and in their entirety. So effectively, we agreed that some of the impermissible terms were never there to begin with, is effectively the common understanding that we tried to arrive at there. But yeah, other than that, it's a lot more straightforward than at least I thought it would be, or that it might surprise people. But it's really, we just come to agree in our new SLA that, hey, this is what it's going to be moving forward. The management council will not approve any contract that has X, and the NFLPA retains their right to challenge anything that they deem impermissible.
Cool. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your relationship with cap managers for teams. And I'm curious, are those, you would think that those relationships would be somewhat adversarial. So let's start there. Is that the nature of your relationships with the folks who are managing the cap for teams?
I think you'd get a different answer for each of the club cap guys that you would ask. There are some that I am very close friends with, some that I have some very good relationships with. Mike Disner with the Lions was kind of a mentor to me before I had really broken through. People like Brian Hampton, Nick Polk, Jackie Davidson, Mike Greenberg. I have
Who are these people, Adam?
Yeah, they're all cap managers and club negotiators. So Mike Disner is the vice president of football administration for the Lions. Mike Greenberg is with the Buccaneers. Brian Hampton's with the 49ers. Nick Polk is with the Falcons. So these are all people that I know and love. We'll text occasionally. What gets really tricky is, yes, we are on opposite sides of the table, and there are times where I am involved in a negotiation, and either they are aware of it for one reason or another, or they are completely unaware of it, and I'm operating in the shadows a little bit. But I think for the most part, people understand that this is business. It's not personal. If a negotiation is contentious, I like to think it's not my doing, although sometimes I can persuade an agent not to take a deal that would have taken a huge load off one of these negotiators' backs. But realistically, I mean, club guys can get, and gals, of course, can get frustrated with me just because I can be a real stickler with contract language or saying no to an offer. And they may know that without my presence, they might be able to get a deal done. But realistically, if a club is trying to get a deal done quick, it's because they think they're getting a good deal on their side. So at the end of the day, that I don't think there's a lot of room to get super frustrated. But yeah, I mean, everyone takes it differently. There's some club guys that I know don't have a super high opinion of me, and there's, like I said, some others that we'll text and I'll ask how their wife is, and we'll go from there. But yeah, it's a unique relationship, and one that's hard to walk, because even with negotiations I'm involved on, there's times where both the club guy and or gal and myself both think that we can probably get this thing done if them and I were just to hop on the phone quickly, but we still have to follow procedure. The agent is the one that represents the player. So even though I have a great relationship with person X on the club side, still have to defer those services to the agent.
Well, I'm about halfway through my list, unfortunately, of questions. There's one more that I'd like to pose before we throw things over to Pat and we open it up for the audience to ask their questions. And that pertains to the new CBA. So there's a new collective bargaining agreement. And one of the terms, one of the, I think, most significant terms is the length of the regular season. So, and Adam, correct me if I'm wrong, I hope I'm not, but the regular season is going to be, under this new CBA, 17 games, up from 16 games, which had been the standard since 1978. And the playoffs are expanding from 12 teams to 14 teams. Now, in my humble opinion, all of this is favorable to ownership. And my question for you is, which terms that the players received in return in this negotiation would you say are most important with respect to this new benefit that ownership is getting?
Yeah, and that's a great question. One thing I do kind of want to deal with up front here is the concept of going from 16 to 17 regular season games. You know, I think when most people, and myself included, when we first start wrapping our heads around that concept, it sounds great for ownership. And one of the big reasons why that a lot of people, I think, try to justify that position with is that, okay, well, it's one more game that a player could get injured, and it's another opportunity for the player's career to get cut short before he can get a new contract X with guarantees. But part of the research that I was involved on, that in fact, we did a more extensive bit of research this summer after the CBA was signed, was finding out that things like injuries and other issues that would prevent a player's continuing services, those are actually more strongly correlated to a player's age than his time played. So what we started figuring out is, look, with a 17th game, yes, our players would prefer to not have that injury risk, but as all things are in negotiations, especially in collective bargaining, is the juice worth the squeeze? And what I think we found out pretty quickly is that, yes, the juice is very worth the squeeze there on the 17th game. Not only are players going to be getting an additional paycheck for that 17th game, but part of what we were really aiming for in the new CBA, which, to answer your question a little more direct way, increases in minimum salaries are huge. Pension plans went up, I think, about 10%. There were so many different various benefits that got added to both active and retired player plans. Training camp conditions were huge for us, and that was a big non-economic term that our membership was really focused on, is making sure there was a more lead up to contact type practices in training camp. To be able to get those things, we had to give something. And for us, when we saw the monetary gain coming from a 17th regular season game, I don't want to say it was a no-brainer, but it was something that was very worth the squeeze in a lot of ways. So yes, although that is something that for sure ownership and management wanted, it's not something that I think a lot of people in our building were even seeing as a complete give or something that is 1,000% favorable for management. What we got in exchange for that, which again, a player's career is more predicated upon their age, or their length of their career is more predicated upon their age than their number of snaps played or anything, as counterintuitive as that may seem. We figured out that the monetary gain from that in the short run alone was huge, but being able to pick up some of these other very important terms that we needed elsewhere in the CBA was equally as big, if not bigger.
Well, I've learned a lot. I thought I knew a little bit about this, but I always learn something in conversation with you about these issues. So I'm having a good hour. Pat?
Yeah, we've got some great questions in the chat here. Let me start off with two questions, kind of join them together. This question is kind of getting at, Adam, do you speak to your equivalents in other sports leagues, other people dealing with caps and this kind of thing? And if you do, what do you talk about? And then to extend that question a bit, do you talk to your counterparts in sports leagues in other countries?
Very interesting questions. So I do actually speak with my counterpart at the NBPA, which is the National Basketball Players Association. I'm not 100% sure if I have a counterpart at the MLB or the NHL, but Kirk Berger is at the NBA. He was actually a guest speaker in my sport finance and capology class. He and I have a tremendous amount of respect for each other. I think he's one of the smartest people in this business. I'm proud to call him both a colleague in a sense and a friend in another. But yeah, we try to communicate, which isn't super frequently, but when we can, we like to sit down, sort of bounce ideas, share experiences. There might be a situation that I had with an agent that can help him if he ever encounters a similar situation. So even though our rules are different, the governing CBA policies are different, if you will, that there are times where, hey, I experienced this issue when working through an injury type situation, just to put it simply. And he might have a suggestion for me, or he might say, hey, I'm dealing with this. Have you experienced this? And I can say, yeah, this is how it resolved. I would be proactive about X, and I would not mention Y, in other words. As far as around the world, I can't say I have. Although I do get requests from time to time from people in other leagues just learning to learn a little more. I had one conversation with someone who worked for one of the German soccer teams, but that was more over roster composition, because the European soccer leagues are currently starting to flirt with the idea of the harder salary cap, I guess I should say. But other than that, Kirk and I talk a good bit, but outside of that, it's a very small fraternity, we'll say.
Okay, another kind of set of questions here, maybe a bit more philosophical, if you will. But the idea that professional athletes in many ways are like celebrities. What would you say to people who don't understand why they would need a union? And to build on that a little bit, do you get a sense that the players have sort of a working class consciousness? I mean, do they sort of see collective bargaining as something that kind of goes beyond their situation? A little philosophical question for you.
No, interesting. I like those. Yeah, I'll answer the second part first. So with player mentalities towards the union and collective bargaining, it's a spectrum, really. There are some players who are very hands-on with this stuff, and they might be super pro-union. There may be others who don't necessarily fully comprehend what we do or what our purpose is as well, which, a lot of players coming into the NFL are recent college graduates or maybe young men who just spent 3 years in college, but a lot are coming out in their early 20s. I can tell you, I knew nothing about labor unions when I was 22. So that I think as a PA, one thing we try to do a lot is to educate our membership as much as possible. You know, when they're coming in as rookies, we have various seminars. We have a player affairs team who some of the most amazing colleagues I've ever had. But they do a really good job of trying to build those opening relationships with players and help them understand, hey, we do X as far as generating benefits. We go to bat for you here. If the club tries fining you, someone from our legal department is going to be there to take your back. So it's not just your agent. And I think that sort of lends itself in a way to the first part of that question. Why are we necessary? Again, I could spend an hour talking about that alone, or else the PA would probably fire me if I couldn't. But either way, it's as much as you have an agent backing you up, having the union who, again, that difference between the utilitarian aspect versus the individual aspect, being able to view things collectively and to specialize in these issues is paramount. It's the same reason why, yes, an agent may negotiate your contract, but an agent does a million other things. That's not his only focus. That's my only focus. That's all I do year round. So the fact that you have a collective group who works directly for you, who can handle all these issues and has those relationships built out is huge. And yeah, it may be difficult to understand, you know, again, I'm 30 now and I still have trouble wrapping my head around some of this stuff. But I think for the players who do enough to understand everything that's at risk and why just one agent representing them alone is not sufficient when dealing with a company like the NFL who makes billions of dollars and who are trying as hard as they can to keep it. I think that's where players can understand, okay, this is why the PA is needed, because they can combat that overwhelming force instead of this one person that I hire to negotiate my contracts.
It's an interesting question. Just asking, what's your reaction to a big contract such as Patrick Mahomes' current contract? So maybe that's a question in terms of, you know, what's your personal reaction, and maybe it is what's the NFLPA's kind of general reaction when you see a large contract like that get agreed to.
So unfortunately, I can't comment on any specific contract. What I can say is it's pretty interesting when I hear about most of these contracts before they get announced, and there are times where contract A may be bigger than contract B, but I'll be sitting here doing high fives and cartwheels over contract B, but thinking, you know, what was this guy thinking with contract A? The one thing that is always kind of interesting that I didn't really realize till I got in this business is when you're listening to the media report numbers, the media rarely has the full picture. You know, that they might be accurate as far as certain things that they're announcing, but what's really interesting in NFL contracts in particular, going back to a question that Mark asked earlier, what makes the NFL difficult is the varying levels of guarantees. So we talk about a total guarantee versus a full guarantee. Those are two completely different things in the NFL. A total guarantee may just be what amount is guaranteed for injury only, and then the full guarantee is what's guaranteed no matter what happens, is the simple way of explaining it. So if I see the media reporting the total guarantee number, which is the higher number, I can instantly guess that the agent was the one who shared that information. And then when it's the full guarantee, which is the lower number, you can usually tell it was the club that provided that information as well. So when my wife, somebody, you have to have a confidant. My wife is mine, obviously. When we're hearing the media, you know, exclaim, "This is the greatest contract ever," and I'm sitting over there shaking my head, I can reasonably explain, well, when you actually look at it, he's not even making 40% of his contract until 2/3 of the way through, or whatever it is. So that's kind of the interesting thing, being in the know with some of these contract issues, is realizing that the face value numbers are not even a tenth of the picture, if you will. But I wish I could comment on certain contracts, but hopefully that answer explains why sometimes capologists will be shaking their heads at these monster contracts, and otherwise be amazed by a contract that's worth a fifth the value. It's all contingent on the context of each player.
You probably can't respond to this question, or maybe you can in part. So this is a question about Colin Kaepernick's case. And I guess one part you might be able to talk about is, to what extent do you think his activism has actually been a game changer of any sort? The part you probably can't respond to is, do you think he'll ever be signed again? But what do you think his impact has really been on the NFL, sports more broadly, and maybe more, a societal level?
Yeah, unfortunately, cannot respond to the second part. I can say with Kaepernick, I think what he's done, you can see at almost every level of current sports. Even the smaller things that I think people take for granted, like the end racism quotes in the back of the end zone. I'm sure you can attribute some of those changes to a number of different situations or people, but I don't think there's any question that he had an impact or a hand in that as well. And that's where, as a PA, we always want to see our membership taking a stand for what they believe in. We want to see them expressing their opinions. One campaign that we launched, which was a colleague of mine, Dior Ginyard, but that they did this athlete and sort of campaign, which is where their athletes will say athlete and whatever else they do outside of sports to help humanize these players, but also help them understand that, hey, just because you are an athlete for your profession does not mean that that's what defines you at the end of the day. And I think with Kaepernick, that was a good example of that as well, is to see someone who's passionate about something and speaking out. And obviously a lot of politics come into play. It was a heated issue for a lot of people, but one way or the other, what we really want for our players is to understand, look, yes, you are an athlete, but at the end of the day, you have the opportunity to speak your mind, and you have the opportunity to make an impact where you want. And I think with Kaepernick, we can see that all throughout the other major leagues at this point.
We've got another question here I guess the broadly speaking would be kind of, where do you see college football players and their entry into the NFL? And the question that is asked is, do you think there will be a one and done rule eventually for the NFL, like there was in NCAA basketball? But what do you kind of see as sort of the future of the college football developmental leagues and NFL?
That's a really intriguing question. I will say, with respect to the one and done rule, I think the NFL would probably be the hardest sport to do that with, specifically because players' bodies are just not ready for the most part coming out of high school. And professional athletes in any sport are the best of the best. Their body is usually in peak training for that specific sport, but each sport requires a different sort of fitness, if you will. And it's not one sport requires a greater fitness than the other. It's simply that it requires a different type of fitness. And with the NFL, these guys are in the weight room 24/7. I mean, these guys are as big, fast, and strong as they can humanly be. And for someone like me, who certainly enjoys college football, and I'll watch high school football from time to time, I just love the sport. I always have. There's a noticeable difference even from some of the best high school players to what are in the pros. Whereas, guys like LeBron James back in the day, he can go straight from high school to being one of the best players in the NBA. And it's not common, but it can happen, with just the difference in the body type from high school players to pro players, which actually Mark would be better suited to answer based on his writing history. But the difference in body preparedness, if you will, that's why I would have a very tough time seeing the one and done rule happen. I mean, maybe for certain positions, but especially for linemen, linebackers, guys like that, I have a really, really difficult time seeing that happen.
This next question is looking at college football athletes. And there's been a lot of collective action, I guess, among college athletes, particularly this season with the start of the season and looking at safety issues. There was, some movement for collective bargaining at Northwestern University several years ago. Just kind of wondering where the NFLPA has been in that debate and discussion. Are they engaged with some of these college movements of player collective movements and so forth?
Unfortunately, I think if I answer that question, our legal department's going to hire a hitman to come keep me out in quarantine. So
We don't want that.
yeah, I think I'm going to have to pass on that one, unfortunately.
Okay, all right.
Hey, Pat, I'd like to drop in, a
Sure,
question
go ahead, Mark.
that's completely predictable for a college professor. And that is, there are probably, a million aspiring capologists out there who would love to have your job and are, desperately trying to figure out what the career path is. I mean, how do you become the capologist for the NFLPA? So, the question is, what advice do you have for young people who have an interest in a career, similar to what you're doing? Does one prepare themselves to at least have a shot at a job like the one you have?
It's a question I get often, and I think to sort of put this in a joking term, when I was working for the Washington football team for the NFLPA, I remember telling my boss at the time, Eric Schaefer, that, hey, I want to do this full time. And I remember I asked him, what can I do to get in this? And he had a one-word response. He said, don't. And he's like, 'cause I think a lot of people don't really understand what all goes into this and how much you actively have to sacrifice. So I think the advice for people that I would give is, don't, but if you're going to, you need to understand what you may sacrifice at any point in time. For someone like me, God bless my wife who stuck with me all these years, but I was not making peanuts until I was much older than some of my peers who were graduating college, and I'm watching a lot of them get their own apartments, and some of them making six figures, and I was at home with my parents making $14,000 a year as a operations manager. And it's tough a lot of times, and you look yourself in the mirror and be like, I can go get a marketing job for way more than this right now. But you really have to want this more than other people, because at the end of the day, Mark, as you alluded to, there are thousands of people who would love to do this, but and the NFL side, there's maybe 60 jobs. With the 32 clubs, some clubs have a second person. At the NFLPA, we really have 3 people who focus on salary cap. And then at the league office, they have, I think, 8 to 10 people. So if you don't know somebody, then you're already behind the 8 ball. So you have to get lucky somewhere along the line. But something that they said in football, both when I was playing and something that's helpful in life, is they say it doesn't matter how big or fast or strong you are. If you're going 90% and the other person's going 100, you're the one that's going to get hurt in drills and whatnot. It's the same thing going for this job. You might be smarter than me. You might be more well-connected than me. But if you're going 90%, I'm going to run you over when we get in that hole every single time. And it's because, Mark, you saw the platform I put together when I was even at grad school at GW. I'd wake up at 6 a.m. I would drive over an hour out to Ashburn we called it Redskins Park back in the day. But I'd drive an hour out there. I would do an unpaid internship until about 4:30. I'd drive an hour and a half back into DC through traffic. I would have school from 7 until I think 10 every night. I would then have to drive home 30 minutes, so about 3 hours round trip in the car every day, do 2 hours of homework, another hour and a half of working on my independent analytics study, go to bed at 2, wake up at 6, do that all over again. And that's for 4 months straight for 3 different semesters. I was doing that. Like, it's a weird thing about now, because I don't feel like I'd have the patience to do that anymore. But that, like, there were friends of mine who on Friday nights were out at the bars doing what normal young people do. I was sitting at my mom's computer working on an analytics program. So you really, this has to be everything in a lot of ways, because if you are not going 100% on this, there's someone like me out there who is going 100%. And again, it's the best advice I can give. This is a brutal business. Don't do it unless you're 100%. But if you're 100%, you got to be 100% every single day, every step of the way.
Sadly, it's 1 o'clock.
Yeah, it is very sad. I've learned so much. This has been just such a great session. And Adam, I really want to thank you for taking the time to spend it with us here for DC LERA. This has just been a great session to end our 2020 events with. And I'm kind of excited. Maybe offline, I'll find out how I can enroll in your sports finance class or whatever the name of that class is that you're teaching. That sounds great. Mark, thanks so much again for being the interviewer here. And thanks so much for all your contributions over time. It's good seeing you again. And his Povich Center puts on tremendous events. So please, check that out. Thank you, Emily Bernadette, for all the support. And also in closing, just want to say our next event will be January 19th. Christy Hoffman, General Secretary, UNI Global, will be speaking. So it should be a great event. So stay tuned. We'll be sending announcements and information about that. Thanks everyone for joining us. And again, Adam, Mark, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me.
Great to be with you.